I promise I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's video where we are going to be looking about the anatomy of the digestive system. If it's your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You put on the notification bell so that whenever I load a video, you are the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the anatomy of what we call the digestive system. Okay. Previously, we talked about the components of the digestive system, where we talked about the alimentary canal and even what we call the accessory digestive organs. So now, today we're going to be looking at them and how they are arranged in what we call the digestive system. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the anatomy of different structures that make what we call the digestive system. Okay? So now this diagrammatic illustration is showing us all the parts that make up what we call the digestive system. Now, starting with this part here, you see this part here, this one here. This part here is what we call the mouth. Okay, is what we call the mouth. And of course, in the mouth, you're going to be having some other structures. You have some structures. For example, we have what we call the teeth. Okay, we have what we call the teeth, and even also we have what we call the tongue. So now, because all are going to be the structures of the digestive system, okay, but they're going to be located within the oral cavity. Okay, so now this one is going to be our oral cavity, which we may simply call the mouth. Okay. Now, we also have these structures. We have these structures which are going to be located under the tongue. Okay, some of them are going to be located just inferior of the ear, and even some of them are going to be located somewhere here. Okay, now these structures are going to be providing what we call saliva. You know how they are called? These structures here, they are called the salivary glands. Okay, they are called the salivary. Glands. Okay, they are called the salivary glands, and they are going to be providing us saliva, which is going to be containing a lot of water, which is going to be containing a lot of enzymes like salivary amylase, what we call lingolipases, and very many others, immunoglobulin A, which aids in immunity. So now you realize that these structures are going to be providing us saliva, which is rich in different substances. Okay. Now, when you come back, the back of the oral cavity, you have this structure. You know how this structure is called? This structure here is what we call the pharynx. Okay, is what we call the pharynx. And of course, the pharynx is very important in the swallowing process. Okay, the pharynx is going to be made up of three parts. It has what we call the nasopharynx, it has what we call the oropharynx, and even has what we call the laryngopharynx. Together, these parts are going to be aiding, like the nasopharynx is going to be helping in the blockage of food substance from going to the nasal cavity, okay, and then the oral cavity, and then the oropharynx is going to be aiding in what we call the down movement of the food during the swallowing process. You know, during swallowing process, we have what we call the pharyngeal phase, okay. So now, during the pharyngeal phase, you're going to be having, we have the pharynx has what we call circular muscles and what we call longitudinal muscles. So now, during pharyngeal phase, you're going to be seeing that these muscles are going to be contracting in a waveform to make sure that food is propelled down until it enters what we call the esophagus. Okay, it is such another beautiful thing. So now the pharynx is aiding in the swallowing process, what we call deglutition. Okay. Now, when you see the whole of this tube from the pharynx, the whole of this tube here is what we call the esophagus. Okay, is what we call the esophagus. And the esophagus is one of the most important tube, and this tube aids in what we call movement of the food down the stomach. And this kind of the tube is just close to 25 centimeters. Okay, it is just close to 25. It is close to 25 centimeters long. Okay, it aids in the down movement of the food into the stomach. Such another beautiful thing. Okay. Then when you see the whole of this jet-shaped structure, okay, this one is what we call the stomach. Okay, is what we call the stomach. And the stomach is very important in the processes of what we call chemical digestion and even what we call mechanical digestion. Now, when we talk of mechanical digestion, which is going to be happening within the stomach, that kind of the muscular contraction to make sure that food is churned down, okay, that's going to be a mechanical process. And of course, when we talk of the chemical process, it means you're going to be having involvement of enzymes, because in the stomach wall, you're going to be having a release of different enzymes, like for example, what we call call the pepsinogen that gets converted into pepsin that starts digesting what we call the proteins. You're going to be having a lot of other secretions like the lingo, what we call the gastric lipases, the hydrochloric acid from the parietal cells, and all other substances are going to be produced within the stomach to aid in what we call chemical and then mechanical digestion. Okay, this is such another beautiful thing. Okay. Then as you just go slightly below the stomach, we have this structure which is going to be located within this C-shaped segment of the small intestine. So now how do we call this leaf-like structure? This leaf-like structure is what we call the pancreas. Okay, is what we call the pancreas. And the pancreas is one of the most important heterocrine gland. And when you talk about the heterocrine gland, I mean that it's going to be exhibiting both endocrine role and then exocrine role. When we talk of endocrine role, it means that its chemicals which is going to be released are going to be getting poured directly into the blood. And of course, when I talk of exocrine role, I mean that the substances which are going to be produced by the pancreas will pass through what we call the duct. Okay, that's why the pancreas exhibits both endocrine role and exocrine role, and that's why it is called a heterocrine gland. Okay, so now this pancreas is going to be providing us what we call the pancreatic digestive juices that aids in what we call chemical digestion of what we call different substances within the small intestine. Besides that, we have an endocrine role of the pancreas whereby it's going to be providing us a lot of hormones which regulate sugar levels like insulin and even also what we call glucagon that aids in regulation of what we call the sugars. So the pancreas is one of the most important structure within the digestive system. Okay. When we come after the stomach, you see the whole of this C-shaped structure. You see this structure. Now the whole of this structure, whole of it is going to be the small intestine. But of course, the small intestine has parts. Okay, we have 3 divisions of the small intestine. Now, when you see the whole of this structure, which is going to be like having blue dots, the whole of this structure here, this one here is what we call the duodenum. Okay, is what we call the duodenum. Okay, so now it is that kind of the C-shaped structure which is going to be housing the head of the pancreas. Okay, and is always the first segment of what we call the small intestine. It's super very important. Okay, then after the duodenum, we also have this another kind of the segment of the small intestine. You know how this segment is called? This segment here after the duodenum is what we call jejunum. Okay, is what we call the jejunum. Okay, what we call the jejunum, and of course the jejunum is close to around 2.5 meters long. Okay, and then for the case of duodenum is just around 25 centimeters long. Okay, meaning that the duodenum is very short as compared to what we call the jejunum. Okay. And then the last kind of the segment of the small intestine, as you transition into another kind of the intestine, which you call the large intestine, this last one, which is dotted green, the very longest one. You know how this kind of the small intestine segment is called? This one here is what we call the ileum. Okay, is what we call the ileum. And the ileum is going to be very much responsible for what we call the absorption of different nutrients. And of course, the whole small intestine is going to be aiding what we call absorption of nutrients. Okay, but mainly we're going to be having the bigger percentage of what we call absorption taking place within the jejunum and even what we call the ileum. In the duodenum, we also have some little bit of what we call absorption, but mainly we're going to be having some kind of what we call mechanical digestion, whereby we have what we call emulsification of fats by the influence of bile, which is coming through what we call the biliary system. It is such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now the ileum is just mainly approximately around 3.5 meters long. Okay, it is super very long. So now generally the small intestine is close between 6 to 7 meters long. Okay, it's such another beautiful thing. Okay, So now, from now the ileum, now you realize that we are going to be going into this kind of now which we call the large intestine, or which even call the colon. Okay. So now, when you come on this kind of the first kind of the portion of what we call the large intestine, you know how do we call this kind of this portion whereby we have the ileum connecting to this kind of the portion that begins what we call the colon. This kind of dilated segment, this structure here is what we call the cecum. Okay, is what we call the cecum. Okay, so now the cecum is going to be having a finger-like projection structure just inferior to it. You know how this structure is called? This kind of finger-like structure, which is going to be part of what we call the cecum, is what we call the appendix. Okay, is what we call the appendix. Okay, is what we call the appendix. Okay. Now, after the cecum, as you move up, remember our substances have left the ileum. They are now in what we call the colon. Now, after leaving the cecum, now this kind of the colon which is moving up. You know how this colon is called? This one is what we call the ascending colon. Okay. So now this one here is what we call ascending. Is what we call ascending colon. Okay, and of course the primary role of what we call the colon or the large intestine is going to be mainly absorption of water and electrolytes, plus even what we call formation of what we call the fecal matter. It is such another beautiful thing. Okay, now as you move with the ascending colon, now this ascending colon is going to be coming, and then it makes this corner. Okay, there's this corner as it is moving, and then it makes this corner. You know how do we call this corner here? This the corner, which is going to be made by what we call the ascending colon, and this one which we call the transverse colon. This the corner is what we call hepatic flexure. Okay, this one here is what we call hepatic flexure. Okay, is what we call hepatic flexure. And of course, hepatic flexure is going to be now that bending, the bending of the what we call the ascending colon to this colon which we call the transverse colon. Okay, so now this colon here, okay, is what we call the transverse colon. Okay, this is going to be what we call the transverse colon. Super very important. Okay. And then, of course, when we come to the transverse colon, it is going to be reaching here, and then it bends down. You see, there's again another flexure here. Okay, there is another bend here. You know how do we call this bend here? This bend here is what we call splenic. Flexure. Okay, is what we call splenic flexure. And because this splenic flexure, because we're going to be having what we call the spleen somewhere just up here. Okay, and that's what it's just called the splenic flexure. And of course, the whole of this colon which is moving down, you know how it is called? It is just simply called the descending colon. Okay, this one is just simply called the descending colon. Okay. Now, as you move down the descending colon, there is this very big the dilated structure here. Okay, this the dilated structure just after what we call the descending colon. You know how do we call this dilated portion of the large intestine? This one here is what we call the sigmoid. Colon. Okay, and then immediately after the sigmoid colon, we are going to be seeing this this structure here that houses the fecal matter temporarily before it exits. Okay, so now how do we call that temporary store of the feces before it exits? It is what we call the rectum. So now this this portion here is what we call the rectum. Okay, is what we call the rectum. It is super very important, housing fecal matter temporarily before it exits. And the feces is going to be exiting through this the beautiful tiny canal. You know how we call this canal here that allows the expulsion of what we call elimination of what we call the feces. This one here is what we call the anus. Okay, is what we call the anus, and it is going to be that the exit point of what we call the fecal matter. Okay, it is such another beautiful thing. Okay, Now, again, when we come back up here, we have this structure, which is going to be part of what we call the accessory digestive organ. You know how do we call this structure here? This structure here is what we call the liver. Okay, this structure here is what we call the liver. And of course, the liver is going to be very important in what we call production of what we call bile, of which bile is going to be moving and gets stored and concentrated in one of the beautiful structure. You know where that structure how it's called, where bile has to go and get stored and then concentrated. That structure is this green structure here. This green structure here, do you know what it's called? This structure here is what we call the gallbladder. Okay, is what we call the gallbladder. So now the gallbladder is going to be helping in storage of bile, which is secreted by the liver, and then concentrating it, such that when someone eats a fatty meal, this of what we call the gallbladder is going to be contracting and eject out the bile, which will come down into the segment of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum, for the process of emulsification. Okay, it is such another beautiful thing. So now the pancreas, what you call the liver, and then the gallbladder, plus the couple of different ducts, collectively they make what you call the biliary system. So later we shall come and extract what you call the biliary system. Okay. So now these are the parts of what we call the digestive system, and exactly where they are going to be and exactly where they are going to be located. Okay. So now having looked at the anatomy of the digestive system, let me go ahead and hit this the objective. I was saying that the sphincters, which are going to be located within the digestive system. It is something very important because these sphincters are going to be regulating the speed at which food is going to be moving within what we call the alimentary canal. Okay, mainly these sphincters are going to be residing within the alimentary canal, regulating how food is going to be moving from one segment to the another, from one part of the alimentary canal to another. Okay, so let's go ahead and see the different sphincters within the alimentary canal. Okay, so now when you see these red spots, you see these red spots. Okay, these red spots, this one here, those are showing the sphincters within the alimentary canal. Okay, so now when we come to this sphincter here, this sphincter here just at the beginning of what we call the esophagus, on the upper part of the esophagus. You know how this sphincter is called? This sphincter here is what we call the upper esophageal sphincter. Okay, upper esophageal sphincter. Okay, it is going to be helping in allowing food to move into what we call the esophagus. So now, meaning that if this the sphincter doesn't open, we shall not have the movement of the food into what we call the esophagus. It is super dangerous for the case of the failure of this upper esophageal sphincter failing to what we call to open. Okay. And then when you move down towards the stomach, we also have this sphincter, and this sphincter is going to be helping in the movement of the food to drop into the stomach. You know how this sphincter is called? It is going to be on the lower end of your esophagus. You may even simply call it the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, but there's another beautiful term. You know how this beautiful term is called? This the sphincter can even also be called the cardiac. What we call the cardiac sphincter. Okay, the cardiac sphincter. It is going to be regulating the food entry into what we call the stomach. Super very important. Okay. Now, after food has been digested mechanically and then chemically in the stomach, before it goes into the small intestine, there is another gate. Okay, there is another sphincter here. You know how do we call this sphincter here? That regulates how much of the chyme should leave the stomach into what we call the small intestine. This the sphincter here is what we call the pyloric sphincter. So now this one here is what we call the pyloric. Pyloric sphincter. Okay, pyloric sphincter. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. So now we have this sphincter here, we also have this sphincter here. Okay, then As the small intestine, which you call the ileum, as it transitions into what we call the large intestine, it is also going to be another valve. There's going to be another sphincter that's connecting the ileum to this kind of the portion which we called the cecum. You know how this valve is called? This valve here is what we call the ileothecal valve. Okay, it is just this one here is what we call the ileothecal valve, meaning that it is regulating how much of the content will leave the small intestine into what we call the cecum. It is super very important. Okay. And then when we come to what we call the rectum, we also have two kind of the sphincters. Okay, we also have this kind of two sphincters. How do we call these sphincters? We have the one which is going to be inside, the internal, and then we also have what we call the external sphincters. You know how these sphincters are called? The one which is going to be inside, okay, which is going to be inside is what we call the internal anal sphincter. Okay, so now this one here is what we call the internal internal anal sphincter. Okay, and of course the internal anal sphincter is going to be under what we call autonomic control. We do not have control over what we call the internal anal sphincter. And then we also have what we call the external anal sphincter. This one we have fully control over it because it's under what we call the somatic nervous system. Okay, so now this one here, outer one, is what we call the external anal sphincter. Okay, now this one is going to be what we call external anal sphincter, which is going to be under control of what we call the somatic nervous system, or even we have fully control over it because it is made up of what we call the skeletal muscles. So now there is another sphincter. Which is going to be mainly part of what we call the accessory digestive organs, which is going to be allowing the movement of the pancreatic digestive juice and even what we call the bile from the respective areas. It is this sphincter here that allows substances, chemical substances like the bile and even what we call the pancreatic juice to move into the duodenum. You know how this sphincter is called? This sphincter here is just called the sphincter of Oddi. Okay, this sphincter here, just here, is what we call the sphincter. The sphincter of Oddi. It is super very important. That's going to be regulating how much of the pancreatic digestive juice has to leave this biliary system to flow into the first segment of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum. Okay. So now, having covered the anatomy, having covered the function of those parts, having covered the sphincters, ladies and gentlemen, this comes to the end of today's session of covering the anatomy and then the sphincters within the digestive system. Now, in the next video, we are going to be now extracting all of these parts individually, and we extract it individually and we dive into it and explain to it the anatomy and then the physiology at a molecular level. Thank you very much for watching, and if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, you are benefiting, please, you can support me, and you can do that by a couple of means. You can like the video, you comment down in the comment section, you can share this video to someone else who is in need of this kind of information, and don't forget at the end of it all to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching TUMNAD, as always, until we meet next time.